often do we walk into a room, metaphorically, and tell the punchline of a joke without telling the whole setup for the joke? That's what ends up happening in business all the time. Business is messy and unpredictable.
Sometimes lonely.
So lonely.
So lonely.
And inspiration can often come from really weird places.
We pick up where the bullet point blogs and the highlight reels leave off.
We start with the stories. Welcome back to So Here's My Story. I'm Jody.
I'm Elliot.
And before we jump into my story, which is actually a story from our listeners, I just want to remind everyone that anyone who is in the Facebook group by the end of the first week in January will be eligible for our super special drawing.
Super special.
Which prizes as yet unidentified, but will include things like gift cards and the whiskey shot glasses and who knows what else. We're still figuring it out as we go.
Yes, we are.
So if you want to get to the Facebook group, you can text the word story to 345-345, or you can join via our Facebook page or at our website, sohere'smystory.com. And while you're at it, the best holiday gift ever, tell a friend about the podcast.
Absolutely.
All right, let's take it away.
Okay, so in today's story, Jody brings us a story from a listener, actually. So it's a listener story about Sophie's choice, difficult choices, and setup.
So here's my story. And it's actually a really cool thing is that I got to talk to one of our listeners and they were telling me how much they enjoyed the show and that they were really learning a lot from it. And then he said, I really wish you'd do an episode about ...
Ooh, so this is a listener story.
It's like a listener request story.
Very cool.
So, this is very exciting because it's a topic that I end up thinking about quite a lot. So to make a very long story short, he had gone through gymnastics, like Olympic level gymnastics, to avoid what would have been a pretty catastrophic layoff situation at his company. And he did that by crunching numbers and then advocating and campaigning with leadership and convincing everyone to instead do this relatively short-termish across the board, including leadership, pay cut. Of a not small percentage. I mean, so fair enough.
Are we talking years pay cut?
No, just weeks or maybe months, but not. I don't remember the exact details.
Okay.
But it wasn't like for the next 2 years we'll be at 50%. It wasn't anything like that. Okay. But still, to be fair, not everyone has 15-20% of their pay sitting around.
No,
so people. This is not to say people aren't allowed their very legitimate emotional reactions, but that's not the part I want to focus on for this.
Okay.
He was really frustrated by the fact that, he was feeling good about this. And
because he saved all these jobs.
Yes, because the alternative was not like 2 people get laid off. It was a cutting into meat, large swaths of a lot of people getting laid off. And this saved that.
Yeah.
So he individually explains it to all of them, which I'm sure was a painful and laborious day.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. And no one got, they were most of them were mad. No one appreciated all these Olympics that had to, I mean, of course he didn't explain it to them like I did this and I did this because he didn't make it about him.
So he had angry and resentful conversations one after the other.
Yeah, I'm sure it was a great day.
It had to be a great day.
So here's the point. And we could do an entire episode on layoffs versus pay cuts. And I mean, those topics are very real and very legitimate. But I want to hone in on this one little piece of a thing that I see happening over and over and over again. And that is anytime that you're leading something as a parent, or frankly, not even leading something, but you're in relationship with another person or parenting falls into this category. You go through this whole thought process. You go through a whole campaign. You go through an entire strategic vetting, decision tree, matrix kind of thing to get to an end point.
Right.
And then you try and communicate to someone who did not go through that process with you.
Yeah. And
they almost never get it for that reason. But then there's all this frustration as if it feels personal or it feels like they don't get you or that they don't understand the problem. And this thing I want to surface is no, they just didn't get to hear the setup. And what popped into my mind as I was driving here this morning is it's kind of like, and this is the thing I want to think about, is how often do we do this? How often do we walk into a room, metaphorically, and tell the punchline of a joke without telling the whole setup for the joke? And that's what ends up happening in business all the time, is we're like dropping the end point of a long thing, the punchline, without the person having the benefit of the entire path we got there. Now, that's not to say they have to be part of every little bit along the way, but they need some amount of that like line of sight to how you got there.
They do.
Or they're lost.
It's hard to figure out exactly where to bring them in because as a leader, you don't want to say, so I'm thinking we may have to lay off half the company.
What do you think?
What do you guys think?
Any ideas?
I'm noodling around with this. There might be other solutions because all of a sudden now you're critical people, and certainly in a small business, most everybody is a critical person.
Yes.
So your critical people are dusting off their resumes and they think this is an unstable place to work and they're abandoning ship before you realize. So you can't necessarily bring them in at that point. So not that. But then the other end is to, like you said, bring them in at the punchline of the joke, and they haven't gone through the process, which is so important in validating the destination, how you got there.
Right. And this will be a little bit tricky because a lot of the things that I would like to surface won't actually apply to this example. So they'll kind of like fall out of the matrix, but I think they apply to so many other things. I still want to surface them because there's no version where you could actually do this. But I would, from a scientific study standpoint, just imagine for a second that if you could bring everybody into the room and say, hey guys, we have two choices. We can either lay off, let's say 60% of you, 70, whatever, 50, whatever the number is, or we can all take some amount of a reasonably substantial pay cut for a certain amount of time. What do you think? And then here's what would happen if you could do this, because this is the process. People would have their immediate reactions, possibly imagining they couldn't possibly be one of the people who would be laid off, which is a whole other part of it, and be like, well, let's just lay people off, assuming it was other people. So say somebody had that reaction, you can then point out, right, but like that 60% of you, realize the statistics at which that might include you. So just like help them sort of think through all the pieces. And it would be so interesting to see like what would those same people who hate this option, what would they decide if they had to think about and if they could see all the things that you are thinking about and seeing?
Well, I think that in a vacuum, they would think, I'm not going to be one of the people that's cut. And that you can mock me if this is way off field. But I once...
Can I mock you regardless?
You can mock me in advance, but it's not as much fun. So I was reading about the psychological experiment, and then I carried it out in my class. In extra credit for a final exam, I put as one of the extra credits, I said, look, you have a choice. You can say, I want 10 extra points. If only 5 people in the class choose that, all 5 who choose that are 4 or 3 or 2 or 1 will get the 10 extra points. If more than 5 choose that, you get nothing. Or you can choose, I want 2 extra points. If 50% of the class chooses 2 extra points, everybody gets the 2 extra points.
So this is, do you vote for the whole or do you vote for
the whole or do you vote for yourself?
Although it's not as clear what voting for yourself even looks like, because by being selfish, you increase the odds that you get nothing. So it is a gamble.
Yeah, it's a gamble. But it still spoke to it. And each time, I've done this 3 times, each time, way more people voted for the 10 points. Because and that was
the 2, right?
When if more than 5 people voted for it, they got 0.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So, but the reason I bring this up is because each person made the decision that I'm going to be the one to win in this particular equation, right? And so if you give people that choice of, look, I'm going to have to make massive cuts, or everybody takes a pay cut,
bears some of the weight.
I think that speaks to the fact that most people would think, I'm so important here, I can't possibly be cut.
Maybe, and I don't want to get too wrapped up in the dynamics of balancing these two options. But here's what I think is interesting: is in that situation, no matter where someone comes to, even if they don't end up agreeing with you, my theory is if they have walked the path a little bit and thought through all the things, they might still come to a different conclusion than you do, but they will still better understand why there's a difference in I disagree versus I think you just made a completely out of the blue,
right? Like arbitrary and capricious.
Yes, you're still a couple steps closer to understanding and buy-in. It's not buy-in like I agree, but it's buy-in like, well, at least I understand what you were deciding between, and I disagree with it. But to me, at least that feels better than just
Well, I agree it does. But the other thing that I was thinking, which does not help our listener in this particular situation, but may going forward, and that is when we talk about setup, like setup for a joke or whatever, let's back up a bit. If they're in a business which seems like it's subject to various economic factors, it's not constant throughout.
Okay, so I was like, are there businesses that
no,
aren't?
but I mean volatile. There's a certain degree of volatility.
Gotcha.
So they have a bad year and they might have to be facing catastrophic layoffs or across the board salary cuts. And then maybe the opposite is true. They have a really good year and they're looking at a really vibrant bonus structure. And so maybe one of the things to consider is you have your team before either one of those things becomes a reality. On January 1st or January 3rd, you say, look, if we have a great year, we're going to do bonuses across the board or we're going to do whatever. But let's talk about if we don't, because a lot of times in a company, particularly a small company, people know the writing on the wall. They can see that we're not having a great year and say, I really want to tell you that either tell or ask, but we're kind of a team approach. I'd rather share the bonuses and I'd rather share the pain. And what that means is, yeah, I could lay off 50% of the people, or I'm going to spread this across everybody and we're just going to take some salary cuts and we're all going to get through it together. In other words, what if you set up your culture in advance before this actually means real dollars to get buy-in to the shared pain, shared benefit concept?
I'm trying to think of a different example to use just to kind of lay the groundwork that's not based on this sort of layoff versus pay cuts trade-off, because but you're hinting at it there that it's more than even just buy-in. It's that when people understand a thing. So take a slightly different but still financial kind of version. If somebody's, I'm going to make up a thing, really frustrated because people just go through pens or some other kind of office supply at a just ridiculous clip, and they don't understand what that means. The degree to that's because they don't understand what that means. That's the piece that I find frustrating sometimes when I talk to people who are frustrated that their people don't appreciate the impact of XYZ. And yet they are not giving their people a line of sight into XYZ. That is a very unfair divide. So if you want people to understand a thing, you have to let them see the moving parts behind the curtain of the thing. Maybe not all of them, but some amount of it so that they can see how you got there. But here's a crazy basic thing. Let's say I buy a new sweater, whatever, and it's a terrible color. Wow, this is going to be a really crappy example, but it's all comparative to what the other colors were there. So somebody might be like, why on earth did you pick that color? You're like, well, you should have seen my other three options. My other three options were just insane. But if they saw those other three colors, they're like, oh, you definitely picked the best option. It stinks that you didn't have another option. But then they'll see that, because that's the thing I hear said over and over again was in the frustration is, my goodness, they think this plan that we just rolled out is bad. They should have seen our other three options because they were 10 times worse, but they don't see them.
Well, so I think that one of the challenges then facing a business is we're going to roll out the least bad option on December 15th. So we're going to explain it on December 13th or December 16th. In other words, you don't give any time for people to digest or people to appreciate what the options are. But what if in January or February, because you can look ahead and you can see what the good scenarios are and what the bad scenarios are. And so you can actually, not in one meeting, but in a series of meetings or just educate your people throughout the year. Hey, we're aiming for a great year, but I want to walk you through the decisions if we don't have a good year, and let's talk about them so that nothing in December on December 15th comes as a surprise.
Perfect example. So say let's because I just thought of another example way better than my sweater.
Better than the mandatory sweater purchase?
I know. I was like, this is a really bad example. So let's say that you're getting your renewals for your health insurance and everything's coming in, let's be silly about it, 3 times what it was last year.
Talk about least bad alternatives.
Yeah,
yes.
Talk about least bad alternatives. And you're wringing your hands to try and get the numbers down. And is there anything else we can do now? And you spend weeks weeks. I mean,
Yes,
I have done this.
absolutely.
I have
Yes.
seen people, everybody does this. You're like, oh my gosh, this is terrible. And you're dreading making the announcement. Then you put all this effort into like how to say it in hopes that people aren't too upset. Like,
And they're
we've
like,
all
wait a
felt
minute,
that.
my deductible is double.
Yeah, exactly. It's terrible.
Yeah.
However, imagine if, and I'm not saying this is perfect because it comes with other consequences you have to think through. But if on the day that you got the very first quote back from your insurance folks, you somehow were able to say to people, hey, guess what? We just got the quotes back. They are like mortal fear, terrifyingly awful. We're going to work like crazy for the next few weeks to get them down. But, you know, what we're looking at right now is a minimum of like, you know, it's like 3 times what it was last year. We're going to do everything we can. Because then if you come back and say, okay, it's only double what it was last year, they're still going to hate it, but they will know that you like fought down from triple to double. It frames the process in a way that they at least understand that you didn't just cavalierly accept double, you know, and this makes it all sound like I'm trying to make it so that people aren't mad at you. And it's not about that. It's just they're cheated out of the benefit of understanding. And this is the other layer to it. When they're cheated out of the benefit of understanding what goes into leadership conversations, you are also missing an opportunity to mentor them to be better leaders, because leadership means making really unpleasant decisions. And the earlier you can give people line of sight to that, I do this with my kids a lot. When I know they're not going to like something, I roll them in as soon as I possibly can because I'm like, here's what we're dealing with. So just, you know, help. And sometimes they're actually helpful thinking through other options and whatnot.
No, and I think that particularly from a morale point of view, one of the things you want to do is get employees from, you know, the employees may still look at the options and think, that's bad. But you can take them away from looking at the option and think, you're bad. This company is bad.
Yes.
So get them to appreciate the circumstances.
Yeah, because it's almost like putting them in the passenger seat that you are driving. So then they're shoulder to shoulder with you. They see they can see that the road is icy or that there wasn't any place to go. Meanwhile, if they're sitting in the back seat blindfolded, first of all, that would be an interesting story.
What kind of car are you driving?
What kind of business are you running? What kind of journey
is this exactly?
Again, not nailing the metaphors today, but if somebody is in the back seat blindfolded for whatever reason, and you're swerving or you're sitting still for half an hour not going anywhere, and they don't understand that you're sitting in stop dead traffic, it's the metaphor holds. It's not a great one, but the point is they can't see it. They can't be along the journey. And I get that you can't share and shouldn't share every detail of every little thing.
No, you can't put them around a conference table and say, look, guys, if we have a bad year, should we vote on firing Phyllis? You know,
sorry, Phyllis.
Yeah, I mean, you can't do that. So they can't be shoulder to shoulder with you at every different decision point.
Exactly. I mean, you're not going to make a Hunger Games episode out of it, but and again, but this is so much bigger. I see it with like strategic initiatives a lot. People decide like, oh, here's how we're going to handle it. I'm working with a leadership team right now, and we have this kind of mantra that we keep throwing on the table to always remember to try this first. Anytime some conversation that I'm facilitating starts to feel like long or kind of arduous, that is my clue that there's a good chance that the answer actually isn't even in this room, that it's a thing to toss down to their newly formed like second layer of management. Say, hey guys, why don't you take a crack at this? And then we'll all meet and discuss it and take it from there. Because it's probably that it needs to be rolled down a level so that they can take a first crack at it. And not only does that make it easier to lead, but it also helps them develop that leadership mindset of having to think about all the variables. Because the first time we did it, they came back with a not all the way thought through because they don't know all the unintended consequences they have to think about. So they came back with a very easy answer, you know, right off the cuff. We're like, great. Okay, we also have to think about this, 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 and this if we did that. And they're like, oh, yeah, okay. Now let's take a second crack at it. And over time, this past 6 months or so, they are coming back with better and better and better solutions because they're learning how to think about the full landscape, which you have to do as a leader.
Well, I think that does develop leadership. I will tell you a different way that story turned out. Years and years ago, I did have a meeting with my firm about bonus structure and talking about, if we exceed this threshold, or if we don't exceed this threshold, there might not be any bonuses, or they'll be very small. If we exceed it, how are we dividing this? And we were all coming up with different solutions. I let them come up with different solutions. And then at one point they were saying, okay, we can divide it this way. And what about this threshold? And I was like, well, we have to pay rent,
right.
So they were dealing with an imperfect set of information. They got better and better, but then they finally went, you know what? We see all of the variables here. We would be much happier if you just made the decision and we didn't set anything up.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, but
because they realized how hard it is. Like, this puzzle isn't solvable.
And they didn't want to get into it. And you have this eternal question of, if you have 10 people and $100, do you give them $10 each, or do you give 50 to your highest performer? And they said, you know what? We trust you to be fair.
Yeah.
And that's a fine result. It doesn't develop the leaders, but in terms of employee morale, if they've gone through the process and they made a decision that said, you know what? We see how complicated it is, and what you come out with, we'll give you the benefit of the doubt. We trust you to be fair. I'm fine with that.
Right. Because everybody in their lives at one point or another has to make unpopular decisions. Like, people understand that there are not great decisions you have to make. And if they have some idea of the pieces, they at least have the groundwork to be more understanding. It does not mean they're going to like it. I mean, there's no version of our listener's story where at the end of the day, people are like, good job, great decision.
No,
You're not getting a thank you for a X amount of months pay cut, but you might at least get some compassion or some understanding. The morale piece, people might understand, like, well, this stinks, but I appreciate working for a company that even the leadership's taking a pay cut to keep us on staff, so I don't totally lose my job.
And I'll say one other thing about the listener story, and that is, it doesn't have to end with the however many regrettable conversations and that's it. We went through it. We weather our 8, 10, however many weeks of salary cut story, and we're glad we're through that.
Mm.
What if at the end of that, you sat down, with the company all together or in small chunks and said, okay, here's what happened. Let's take it apart. And let's see how we can avoid this and what decisions led to this. And, so you use this series of regrettable conversations as really fuel for greater transparency, for letting people in on the whole setup and the runway so that you don't repeat it.
Yes. Well, that, and you just made me think of something that, again, may be completely impossible in any given situation, but the concept of it is viable. What if you could set everybody down and say, okay, here's where we are, benchmarking kind of where expenses are. They don't have to know the actual numbers, even just a graph. Just say, like, right now, we would have to take pay cuts until here to get there. But if we can find ways to either increase revenue or drop expenses, we could, in theory, start back to normal pay a week earlier or 2 weeks earlier. If together we can help solve this problem. That's the thing. Like, the more people who understand the problem, in theory, at least in some ways, you have more people who can help solve the problem, or at least understand what that problem is.
And as we know, it becomes so much easier when you're standing at the bottom of the hill with people you trust.
Exactly.
So that's our story.
But the discussion doesn't have to end here.
No, it does not.
In fact, we don't want it to.
No, we don't.
That is why we actually have our private Facebook group,
which we started to make sure that we could get your comments, your rants, your thoughts,
your stories.
You
can find links to that group, as well as show notes and links to subscribe via email, and how to find us just about anywhere you can possibly find podcasts at sohere'smystory.com.
And you can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at SHMS Podcast.
And since we know it takes a village.
Yes, it does.
We'd like to thank our village, our super talented, incredibly patient team.
And occasionally snarky team.
Yeah, but in the best of ways.
Lovingly
snarky.
Yes.
Good mockery.
So a huge shout out to the people who actually help us produce our show. First, our sound engineer, Tom Hansen.
Thanks to Christy Schmier for our brilliant show notes and all the other fantastic writing she does for us.
And to Taylor Mathauer for doing just a little bit of everything.
Including wrangling us.
Which
is no small feat.
No, it's not.
This is Jody Hume.
And I'm Elliot Wagenheim.
And you've been listening to So Here's My Story.